Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone new to my channel or to this podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. Now, we've got a real heavy hitter this week, guys. I was under the assumption that he'd only killed in Wisconsin. However, our killer today also killed in Ohio. But our state is going to be Iowa because he spent some time in his childhood there. So our serial killer today is Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, Jeffrey Dahmer was known by a couple of different names, and I think it was the Milwaukee Slayer, the Milwaukee Strangler. So there was quite a few names for him in the respective throughout the documentaries and all that kind of stuff. But I think if anyone doesn't know the name Jeffrey Dahmer, obviously you haven't really enjoyed watching serial killer documentaries or anything like that, because he's up there with Ted Bundy. There's been a huge amount of documentaries done on him. There was that Netflix TV show, the one before the Menendez brothers, so Monsters, Jeffrey Dahmer, that was with one of my favorite actors of all time, Evan Peters, I think it is, Evan Peters. He's from American Horror Story, so Brian Murphy loves him because obviously he's been in American Horror Story and he's also been in the Monsters Jeffrey Dahmer TV series. A lot to cover on today's episode, so I do really apologize. This one might go for about an hour. So Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st in 1960 in Milwaukee to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. Now, despite many challenges during her pregnancy, he was a very much wanted and loved child. He was happy and he was really healthy. So he enjoyed stuffed bunnies, he wooden blocks, and he really liked his pet dog Frisky. Now, there was quite a few ear and throat infections. He grew up to be a relatively happy little boy, though. His father would actually fondly remember him releasing a bird. So they would both release a bird that they'd nursed back to health. Cradling it in his hand, he lifted it and let it go, and we all felt such joy. He could see that in Jeffrey's eyes that they were just beaming, and it felt like for Lionel one of the happiest memories that he has with his son. However, during some period of his childhood, the family actually relocated to Iowa, while Lionel would pursue his PhD at the Iowa State University. Now, when Jeff was about 4 years old, his father cleaned out the remains of some small animals that had been killed by just little rodents from underneath his house. And as his father collected the tiny little bones, he would notice that Jeff seemed really captivated by the sound the bones made. And his small hands would delve really deeply into the pile of bones. Now, he initially, when Jeffrey was a child, would say it was curiosity, whereas now he sort of backpedals and thinks that, hey, maybe that wasn't just a fleeting interest. There was something a little bit more dark and unsettling about my child and a malicious force developing in my son. Now that taints almost every memory for him of anything good. So his father sort of has made a lot of comments about that there were signs that Jeffrey wasn't quite normal, what he would have thought was normal. But he definitely supported his son through most of his criminal endeavors, we will call them. So in 1966, Lionel would finish up his graduate work in Iowa and started as a graduate chemist in Akron, Ohio. Joyce was then pregnant with their second child, David, and by then Jeffrey was in first grade and become quite fearful and loathing and really lacked in a lot of confidence, showing a lot of reluctance to change and needing familiar places. The once really happy little boy was now shy and distant and not very good at communicating. During this time, I can't remember whether it was before David was born or after David was born, Jeffrey had a hernia operation. There is some research from what I've seen and what I've read that children going under anesthetic at such a young age can cause problems and traumatic exposure and can change the child. The reason I point this out, guys, is because Lionel and Joyce actually said there seemed to be a change within Jeffrey after the surgery. So I don't know if it's parents grasping at, I don't want my child to be this horrendous person. So I'm wondering whether it was parts of that that made them sort of go, hang on, we'll grasp at some straws. However, considering there is some research that does indicate that this can happen, I'm just, it is a bit of food for thought. Now, Lionel would believe that it was from Iowa to Ohio that would cause Jeff's change in behavior, thinking it was a normal reaction to those sort of new surroundings. Lionel was also dealt with some shyness and insecurity as a child and thought that Jeffrey was just sort of very similar to him and he would eventually overcome this. However, Jeff's condition was far more severe and it would actually lead him to be really isolated as a child. Now, in April 1967, they would move again, and Jeff had just he seemed to adjust a little bit better this time. He would form a really close friendship with a boy by the name of Lee, and he would like one of his teachers so much that he would actually give her a present of tadpoles. But when he found out that she'd actually given them to Lee, he would end up killing those tadpoles with motor oil in retaliation. So you can sort of already see there's a little bit of vindictiveness in him, and there is something that's just not quite right. We're already seeing those signs, and Jeff's behaviour would worsen dramatically over the years. Now, his posture and his demeanour changed dramatically. From the ages of 10 to 15, he'd become really rigid and he'd become really inflexible. He would appear quite tense and with a really rigid posture. He'd grown increasingly shy as well, and he would actually tense up when people would approach him. And he spent most of his time either at home, he would either be alone in his room, or he would be staring at television. And his face would often appear to be blank, giving quite the impression that he was moping around without any real purpose or an engagement. But he had one friend, but he drifted apart from him around the age of 15. Lionel actually found out at Jeff's trial, though, that during this period that Jeff would ride around with plastic garbage bags and collect the remains of animals for his own private cemetery. He would actually strip the flesh from their bodies of these roadkills and would end up mounting a dog's head on a stake. There has been indications that Jeff did torture animals. I don't know. I haven't been able to find too much about that, but it's definitely a big indicator with serial killers. He did enjoy cats and dogs in his childhood, and he did keep a pet fish as an adult. It was more his fascination with dead creatures. Given the documentaries and a lot of the paperwork that I've read and the papers that I've read on him, I can't find anything that he actually tortured and killed animals. He did find them dead and pull them apart and see what their insides looked like and stuff like that. And I do apologise. This is going to be a little bit graphic at times, guys, especially given what Jeffrey Dahmer would do. So I'm just not sure that he had it in him to kill animals. But given what he could do to men, I'm not entirely sure. It's when he reaches puberty that he discovers that he's gay, and he just didn't know how to tell his parents. But in his early teens, he would have a really brief relationship with another boy. They wouldn't have a sexual component to their relationship, but even by Jeffrey's admission, he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a much more submissive male partner in his early to mid-teens. And his fantasies would gradually evolve, and they'd focus more on the darker components of what you would think about. Now, these fantasies would also, they'd end up becoming also about dissection and pulling apart bodies and seeing what their insides were like. When he's about 16, he would have a fantasy in particular about a male jogger that he found really attractive, and then making sexual use of his body. On one occasion, he actually concealed himself in the bushes with a baseball bat to lie in wait for this particular jogger. However, thankfully for this jogger, he didn't pass by on this day. He later admitted that this would be his first attempt to attack and actually want to render someone submissive to him. So I'm just going to take a sip of my drink. I'm sorry. He's only 16 at this age, and this is what he's wanting to do to men. So you can see that this pattern's going to get pretty awful throughout his life. He grew far more passive and far more isolated, and he really didn't want to converse with anyone in his family. He would often give one-worded answers, and he would prefer to stick into the world of his fantasies. Now, while other boys are pursuing careers and education and all those kind of things, Jeff was just really unmotivated. He just didn't see any purpose to his life. And given that he was harboring all these fantasies of death and dismemberment, you would think that there would be outliers or indicators that he had a mental health issue. It really just didn't seem to reflect on the outside because he was just already so isolated, and he already didn't communicate. So it really wasn't anything different for his family, and he never really rebelled. He never argued with his parents because everything just didn't seem to matter to him. Like, nothing mattered to him at all. And in high school, he's got average grades. He played tennis and he worked on the school newspaper. Despite all of these activities, he was really seen as a loner and known for bringing liquor to class. He even pulled a prank by getting into the yearbook photo of the National Honor Society. Once it was published, they actually had to black him out. Now, he had already said, and he said it during some of his evaluations, that he'd become a full-blown alcoholic in his teenage years because he was dealing with the fact that he was gay. He was dealing with the fact that he knew he wasn't normal. So he was just trying in any way, shape or form to get through his life. So he's already self-admitted that he's an alcoholic, but before the age of 18. So tension would sort of grow between his parents, and they would end up divorcing when Jeffrey was nearly 18. And that would lead to a custody battle over his younger brother, David, though. Lionel would end up remarrying a lady by the name of Shari, and she actually was the first to notice Jeff's drinking problem. Now, while all this is going on, I think Jeff's having some issues about I think he's having issues dealing with the fact that he's gay and his family's split apart. Now, everyone deals with grief, turmoil, and sadness in different ways. So I'm thinking Jeff dealt with abandonment by killing his victims so they would never actually leave him. Now, I'm wondering if in some way, shape or form, he felt like a bit like his father had abandoned him and just moved on with his new stepmother. And that was where some of these components are coming from. Obviously, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but definitely the more I read on this kind of stuff, there's definitely some attachment and abandonment issues in particular with Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, his first murder would take place shortly after graduating from high school. So on June 18th in 1978, Jeffrey would end up bumping into an 18-year-old hitchhiker by the name of Stephen Hicks. Now, he would invite Stephen back to his house and offer to have some beers and smoke together. As he was alone at home, no one would happen to be home. Stephen was heading to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park in Ohio, and he accepted the invitation really willingly, like beers, free beers, why not? Now, Jeffrey said he felt attracted to this guy on the roadside, but he realized really quickly that Stephen spoke about girls, so he was not remotely interested in that type of relationship. But I'm hearing, again, guys, this is where I'm seeing different articles that there is some components that say they had a sexual encounter, some that don't. I think, given the nature of the fact that he killed him, I think he didn't. This is my personal belief. I don't think Stephen and Jeffrey actually had a sexual encounter. So after several hours of talking and drinking and listening to music, Stephen says, I want to leave, except Jeffrey didn't want him to leave. So he hit him with a dumbbell quite a few times. He said he struck him from behind while he's sitting in a chair. And while Stephen was unconscious, he would strangle him to death with the bar of the dumbbell. Then he would strip him naked before he sort of started exploring his body, we'll say. And he would end up masturbating over his dead body. Hours later, though, Jeffrey would actually take Stephen's body to his basement. Now, he would later bury the remains in a shallow grave in his backyard. Several weeks later, though, he would dig up the remains and remove the flesh from the bones, and he dissolved the flesh in acid before flushing all of that down the toilet. He then crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in some woodland behind the family home. He would say that during his confession that he threw Stephen's necklace and the knife he used to dismember from one of the bridges, so the West Bath Road Bridge, into the Chagua River. So he's 18, I believe, at this stage. And he's already committed his first murder. And the whole reason behind why he wanted to kill Stephen Hicks was because of that fear of, oh, I don't want you to leave. And you feel like my first friend. Like, you feel like you're going to be my friend and I want you to stay. So the only way I can get you to stay is by killing you. But then there's also the acts of sexual nature after he has killed him. So obviously there is some sexual component to this. Now, 6 weeks after Stephen's murder, his dad and his new stepmom would encourage him to go to Ohio State University in 1978. He would end up flunking out because of his excessive drinking. He refused afterwards to get a job or to help around the house. So Lionel ended up giving him an ultimatum: join the army or get a job. So in January 1979, Jeffrey joined the armed forces. But even during his time in the armed forces, he continued to drink really heavily. And his life's showing all these ups and downs. He liked the army, but discharged early for being a drunk, basically. He then had to move in with his grandmother and got a job, but's later arrested for drunkenness and disorderly conduct. The offences obviously get a lot worse as his alcoholism and emotional problems intensified. Things like indecent exposure. There would actually also be a charge relating to child molestation. And finally, obviously, the worst discovery of all was when the police would arrest him for multiple murders. Now, even during these times before the murders, his father was always there to support him. He would pay for his lawyers, he encouraged him to get treatment, and he really wanted Jeffrey to get better. Yet each time his hopes were crushed because more and more severe problems with him would be encountered, and he realized that his son was actually beyond his help. The reason Jeffrey Dahmer sort of intrigued me many, many years ago, especially during documentaries, is it did seem like he was the only serial killer that I could find. Now, do not get me wrong. This was only when it was very new and I'd started first watching documentaries. He seemed to be the only one with a normal childhood. He seemed to have a normal mum and dad. There was no massive amounts of trauma. There was no huge signs of abuse. There was no huge indicators. There was definitely components to his childhood, but it was just really weird. And I was always so intrigued by it because his dad stood by him so much. Now, I'm not so sure about his mum, so maybe that's where some of it comes from. But a lot of what I've read is all about Lionel and how much Lionel really supported his son. Even his grandma, it's really, really weird. It would be over 9 years before he would actually commit another murder, though. And unfortunately for the gay community in this area, he would be the worst type of nightmare to come true. Now, also, before I start this, guys, I'm going to get a little opinionated on the police in this particular era in the 1980s. this really disturbed me in the fact that they really didn't do much for the homosexual community. There was quite a few encounters where they could have, caught him and they could have done things, and it just seems like there was just nothing done. So we're going to get through it, but there's quite a bit to get through. So on September 15th in 1987, Jeffrey spent the day drinking at a gay bar. It was called Club 219, and he met a gentleman by the name of Stephen Toomey. Now, they chatted with each other for a few hours and they eventually would leave the bar together. They went to a hotel and rented a room. Now, he would claim he couldn't remember what happened once they got to that hotel, only that he drank a lot. He wasn't even sure if they had any type of sexual relations. But when he woke up, Stephen Toomey was dead. Now, it seems that Jeffrey beat him very badly and would strangle him. Now, after this, Jeff would end up going out and buying a huge suitcase. He then would stuff Stephen Toomey's body inside and catch a cab back to his grandmother's house. He happened to live in the basement at the time. Once he was there, he cut up the body and placed the pieces in different garbage bags and put it on the curb for the next day's trash. It's really, really, really appalling to me that he had so little regard already for his victims, that this is what he's doing to them. On January 16th, 1988, Jeffrey's next victim, he would only be 14 years old. Jeffrey approached a young male prostitute by the name of James Doxeter and offered him money to make a video with himself. He would agree. James agreed. So Jeff took him home to his basement room. It was there that James was given a drug concoction, and once he passed out, Jeffrey would end up strangling him. He then would strip the body of all of its flesh by using acid, and then he smashed the bones up with a sledgehammer, similar to what he had done to Stephen Hicks. Now, after he's been satisfied with his work, he scattered the bone fragments, and he really, in my opinion, is a pretty vile human being, and he didn't have any real regard for any sort of human life. And he is a 14-year-old boy. So this is what is going through my head. You're doing this to a 14-year-old child. So he's becoming, though, to get a little bit of a pattern already. He's luring his victims by offering them money for posing for photographs or just to enjoy some beer and videos. And then he would drug them. He would strangle them. He would masturbate over their bodies or have sex with their corpses later. He's dismembering the bodies and he's disposing of them. So we're going to find out in a little bit that sometimes he would keep the skulls or other body parts as souvenirs. He would definitely use the same pattern again on his next victim. So on March 24th in 1988, Jeff would meet Richard Guerrero. And now this bar that he met Richard at was called Phoenix. Richard was broke, and once again, Jeff would offer him money if he would come back to his place and make a video. Richard agreed, and once back at Jeffrey's place, they would end up having oral sex, and then Jeff offered him a drink, and quite willingly, Richard accepted, but shortly afterwards, Richard was then strangled and dismembered and disposed of. There's been dispute, though, that Richard was not gay, and I'm just wondering if the reason that Richard agreed so easily because he was so desperate for money. Now, that's, by the way, that in no way, shape or form is any type of judgment. So it's just, I think that was why he took the money and why he went back to Jeffrey's place. But it's around this time that we actually encounter two known survivors of Jeffrey Dahmer. So on April 23rd, Dahmer would lure Ronald Flowers Jr. to his house and he gave him a drugged coffee. Now, despite Jeffrey trying to attempt to lie to his grandma, she realised that he wasn't alone. And because of this, Jeffrey was unable to actually end up killing Ronald. So after Ronald became unconscious, Jeffrey ended up taking him to the County General Hospital. It's around this time, though, that his grandmother is growing concerned about a foul odour from the basement. So in September 1988, she actually asked him to move out due to his drinking and bringing young men home late at night and the bad smells from the basement and the garage. Once Jeff has his own apartment, it allowed him the privacy to do what he wanted to his victims. And whilst I understand why his grandmother asked him to move out, I do have to wonder if he'd stayed, whether the count of men being murdered would have been less or more, or would Jeff have turned his anger towards his grandmother? So, I mean, that's just pure speculation, right? That's sort of where my head goes. Would it have been worse or would it have been better? In September of 1988, Jeffrey would actually move into an apartment on North 24th Street in Milwaukee. The very next day, he got into serious amounts of trouble, though. He would offer a 13-year-old boy from Laos $50 to pose for some pictures. Now, he drugged this boy and fondled him, but did not get violent or have intercourse with him. But unfortunately, as a coincidence, this boy's last name is Sintha Somathan. He would be the older brother of a boy that Jeffrey Dahmer would end up killing in May of 1991. Now, the boy's parents realised pretty quickly that there was something wrong with their child, and they took him to the hospital where it was confirmed that he had been drugged. So the police would end up actually picking up Jeffrey at his job, and he was working at the Ambrosia Chocolatier. He was arrested for sexual exploitation of a child and second-degree sexual assault. So on January 30th, 1989, he pled guilty, although he claimed that he thought the boy was much older than he was. Sentencing for this incident, though, wouldn't take place for around 5 months. So it's around this time, it's around the time of this arrest that he'd move back into his grandmother's house, or he'd have his apartment as well. I couldn't quite gauge it in some of the articles that I read. There's no real info as to why he had both, but I suspect it has to do with bail conditions, or his family saying that you can't have your own apartment because of what you did when you lived by yourself. I don't know. So in March 1990, Jeffrey would meet his next victim at Le Cage, which was known to also be a gay bar, but his next victim was Anthony Sears. He would end up taking Anthony back to his grandmother's house because he assumed at the time that police were watching his apartment. So once they've had sex, shortly after, Jeffrey made him a drink and murdered him, but he would decide when dismembering and disposing of this body that he would end up actually keeping his skull. And this is where it really gets to a grotesque level of what he does. So at his sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes sentencing, Jeffrey pled guilty, pleaded with the judge for leniency, and he said, "I'm an alcoholic and a homosexual with sexual problems." The judge actually decided to sentence him to 5 years probation and a year and a halfway house so he could continue to work. After 10 months of this, the judge actually granted him early release, despite a letter from Lionel, his father, requesting that he not be released until he received proper treatment. In early March of 1990, he went to stay back with his grandmother, and however, this arrangement was only conditional upon him securing his own residence. Yeah, babe? Sorry, guys, for that random intermission. My partner had actually just knocked before and said dinner was ready, so I went and had some dinner, so I do apologise. So I'm going to start from after 10 months after he'd been sentenced. when he was 10 months into his 1-year probation and in a halfway house, the judge would actually grant him early release, despite a letter from Lionel, his father, requesting him that he not be released until he received treatment. But in early March of 1990, he went to stay with his grandmother. However, this arrangement was conditional upon him securing his own residency. So on May 14th, 1990, he moved into 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213, and this is where we're going to see a severe increase in escalation of the murders, because over the next 15 months, he went on a killing binge that would cost 12 men their lives, and the rate of his murder accelerated, particularly during May, July of 1991, when he was killing at a rate of almost one per week. So all but 3 were African American. 1 was white, 1 was Asian, and 1 was Hispanic. Now, most of all, if not all of them, were homosexual and bisexual, and the youngest was 14 and the eldest being 31. But many of these victims lived in what the police called high-risk lifestyles, and most of the men that he killed apparently had arrest records, and often for serious crimes like arson, sexual assault, rape, and battery. Now, our next victim is by the name of Ray. Ray was new to Milwaukee, and he seemed to just be in the wrong place and run into the wrong man. So Jeff asked Ray back to his apartment to pose for photos. He accepted the invitation, and once he offered him a drink inside his apartment, he passed out. He was then strangled. Now, he then stripped Ray's body and had necrophilia with it. So this was the first corpse that Jeffrey Dahmer admitted to having sexual intercourse with. It's definitely not going to be our last, but once he'd sort of had his fun with Ray's dead body, he would dismember and only keep the skull. And he would end up painting it and preserving it. Now, this masks sort of a collection of all the human souvenirs that are going to start. It's also the following day after Ray's death, he would purchase a Polaroid camera. He took several pictures of Ray's body in suggestive positions before dismembering him. Now, on June 14th in 1990, Jeffrey met Eddie Smith. Now, Eddie readily accepted Jeffrey's advances and went back to his apartment where they had oral sex. Now, afterwards, Jeff offered Eddie a drink, but soon after he passed out, he strangled him, dismembered his body, and threw what he didn't keep into the trash. On July 8th of 1990, Jeff decided to change his MO a little bit. He decided not to bother drugging his victim at all. This is one of the known survivors. He had a 15-year-old Hispanic kid who's been posing for photos, and when he picked up a mallet and he tried to hit him in the head, the boy fought back and would eventually escape. Now, he would end up going to the police, but this is where the young boy would beg the police, please don't tell my foster parents that I'm gay, and the police decided to leave it alone. Now, we do see in a further instance later, and that this happens a little bit, if not quite a bit, in this sort of time, that a lot of police ignored victims from the LGBT community in particular, or even sex workers, just because they consider them high risk and they don't really think that there's a problem. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in the podcast, so I'm just going to continue on. So less than 3 months after the murder of Eddie Smith, Jeffrey Dahmer would encounter a 22-year-old Chicago native by the name of Ernest Miller, and this is outside a bookstore. Ernest would agree to actually go back to Jeffrey's apartment for $50, where he would let him listen to his heart and to his stomach. Now, when Jeffrey attempted to perform oral sex on Ernest, though, he actually said to him, nah, that's going to cost you extra. He would end up getting a drink laced with 2 sleeping pills because he didn't have as much drugs on hand to make him pass out. So he couldn't actually end up strangling Ernest. He would actually end up having to slit his throat. He would actually slice off his biceps and put them in the freezer. He would then take all of the flesh from the bone, but he decided to actually keep the entire skull this time. It's around this time that his neighbours are starting to complain really about that putrid smell that's coming from his apartment. He ended up explaining to the landlord that it was because his fridge was broken, and as soon as he would get it fixed as soon as possible and the smell would go away. It's not going to go away, mate. You've got dead bodies in there and you've got dead body parts in there. At some point in either September or October of 1990, Jeff would meet a 22-year-old father of two named David Thomas. Jeffrey and Thomas were drinking in his apartment, and when Jeff would end up giving David a special drink. He really didn't want to actually end up killing David because he wasn't attracted to him, but he was worried that David would be upset with him for drugging him, and he decided that the best thing to do was to kill him. This time, he actually filmed the dismemberment, and he also took photos of David's severed head in various positions around the apartment. These photos are actually viewed by David Thomas's sister for identification purposes when the police had gone through the apartment. Imagine being that sister and you're having to identify that that's your brother when his head has been dismembered. I can't even think of how horrific and horrifying that would be. And it's not even the right words I'm using. The next victim, he wouldn't actually be killed for 5 months after the murder of David. And I don't know if this is due to him having a cooling off period or if he's got enough body parts and photos to keep his appetite sated. I'm just not sure. But on February 18th in 1991, Jeff would meet Curtis Straughter. Curtis wanted to be a model, so when Jeff mentioned he wanted him to pose for photos, he's readily agreed. He was strangled while he was actually giving Jeff oral sex. Another skull would be kept and painted and preserved. He decided to also keep the hands and his member. I'm not sure why you'd keep that, but okay. On April 7th, 1991, we've got Errol Lindsay, and he was only 19 at the time of his death, and he was met at a local bus stop. Errol was paid by Jeffrey to come back to his apartment, offered him a drink, he accepted, and soon afterwards, Jeff was performing oral sex on his corpse. That would be another skull that he would keep. The fellow residents of this apartment building, though, they're lodging massive complaints to the building manager. It's just this apartment 213. There's some noises that's going on. There's smells, and they feel like they hear the sounds of a chainsaw. So, in response, the building's manager would contact Jeffrey Dahmer several times. Now, he initially explained that the odors were due to his freezer malfunctioning and causing the contents to spoil. On subsequent occasions, he would also say that it was due to the death of his tropical fish that had died. But he kept saying to the building manager, "I'm resolving the issue. I'm doing it. I'm doing it." Now, this is where we're really going to see the escalation, guys. So on May 24th, 1991, he meets Tony Hughes. Now, he was deaf, so Dahmer wrote his offer on paper and handed it to him. $50 to pose for some photos and watch some videos together. He would also be drugged and he would also be strangled. It was then that Jeff left the corpse lying around his bedroom for a few days before dismembering it. He wanted to sleep with Tony a lot more. So on May 27th, 1991, he meets the 14-year-old by the name of Conorak Synthesophone. This is the younger brother of the victim that survived earlier in the podcast. He would meet him at a local bus stop, and it's just he would let the young boy into his apartment. He would drug him. He would end up having sexual intercourse with him. Now, he would drill a hole in his head and inject in that hole acid, then went to go and get himself some beer. Now, amazingly enough, through this horrible ordeal, he actually woke up and was able to get out of the building into the street where the police would find him wandering around, and he's actually quite dazed and nude. You've got a hole in your head. So you are going to be incredibly dazed. And to them, they just wrote him off as a drunk homosexual. And when they spoke to Jeffrey Dahmer, their thoughts were confirmed. They went back to the apartment, noticed nothing out of the ordinary, and left that young 14-year-old boy with Jeffrey Dahmer. The police apparently even made a joke about it on the CB radio. Needless to say that, unfortunately, that boy died and another skull was kept as a souvenir. On June 30th, 1991, Dahmer would travel to Chicago for the Gay Pride Day. And at a bus depot, he would meet Matt Turner. He was an aspiring model. He managed to persuade Matt to return to Milwaukee. He would pay for the Greyhound bus tickets, and they would head back for the 90-mile journey. Now, once he was safely back in that apartment, he was drugged and strangled. He then cut off his head, wrapped it in a plastic bag, and placed it in the freezer. He would then place the torso in a 57-gallon barrel. On July 4th, in 1991, he would visit Chicago again, and he would meet a 23-year-old by the name of Jeremiah Weinberger. This was at a local gay bar, and after Jeremiah's roommate said that Jeff seemed all right, he decided to actually accompany him back to Milwaukee as well. He would pay for their Greyhound bus again, and when he arrived back at Jeff's apartment, they had sex, and Jeremiah would end up spending the night. It was only when he said he was going home that Jeff panicked and actually offered him a farewell drink, and that would be another drug concoction. He would end up being strangled, and Jeremiah's head would be found in his freezer. On July 12th, he would meet Oliver Lacey. They would also go back to Jeff's place, have a drink, fool around, and eventually lead to strangulation again. This was going to be another time where he would engage in necrophilia again. He would slice the right bicep off and engage in cannibalism, and he would eat it. So he would place his head in the fridge next to an open box of Arm & Hammer baking soda, and his heart would be placed in the freezer because he wanted to eat that later. He would also keep another skeleton. He was suspended from his job at this time, Jeff, for spending too many days at home, and this upset him because it would actually lead to his firing on July 19th. Now, our last known victim was Joseph Braidhoft. So on July 19th, the same day he was fired, Jeff met Joseph at a local bus stop. It was pouring down rain. Joseph had a 6-pack of beer on him, so he decided to go back to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment to party a bit. Once they'd engaged in sexual acts, he would be drugged and he would be strangled. He would actually sleep with the body for the next few days. He cleaned it, he put it in the freezer, along with heads of Turner and Weinberger, and he placed the torso in one of the gallons inside his bedroom. He really did seem to lack a lot of control now. He didn't really care. He was becoming really sloppy. It's really only a matter of time before he's going to be caught by the police. And this is where we're going to talk about it with the introduction of one of his survivors, Tracy Edwards. Now, the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's murdering spree would end with the meeting of this man. If only the times that the police had been previously called to Jeff's apartment, they'd recognise that they were dealing with a serial killer. We can't really talk about that because it doesn't really give any justice to the victims, does it? But at the same time, I get really frustrated at this because there was quite a few opportunities for them to stop this from happening. And I feel like he's only escalated and escalated and escalated. And yes, there are no bodies for them to find or anything like that. But you are seeing an increase in the amount of missing young men around the neighborhood, and you're doing nothing about this. Like, what's going on? So On July 22nd, 1991, so 3 days after his last victim, Jeffrey approached 3 men with an offer of $100 to accompany him back to his apartment for photographs, drink beer, and just to keep him company. So one of the men, a 32-year-old by the name of Tracy Edwards, he agreed to go back to his apartment. It's when they get back there that Edwards is noticing a bit of an unpleasant smell and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor. He explained that was for cleaning bricks. Sure. Jeffrey would then show a knife and tell Edwards he intended to take nude photos of him, and he would be handcuffed. Now, in an attempt to sort of appease the situation, Tracy unbuttoned his shirt and saying that he would allow him to do so if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. So in response to this promise, Jeffrey Dahmer simply turned his attention back towards the TV. It was then that Edwards sort of observed Jeffrey rocking back and forth, chanting, before his attention was turned back to him. He placed his head on Edwards' chest, Jeffrey did, and listened to his heartbeat with the knife pressed against it. And he informed Tracy that he had the intention to eat his heart. So there were multiple attempts to prevent Jeffrey from attacking him. Tracy repeated that he was Jeffrey's friend and that he's not going to run away. It's then Tracy has decided that he was either going to jump from a window or run through the unlocked front door when the opportunity arose. When Tracy next stated, when he sort of said, hey, I actually need to use the bathroom, he asked if they could sit with a beer in the living room where there was air conditioning. Jeffrey immediately consented, and the pair was walking back to the living room when Edwards exits the bathroom. And instead of heading to the living room, he noticed that Jeffrey sort of had a little bit of a lapse of concentration, and then he rose from the couch and he noted that Jeffrey was not holding the handcuffs, so he wasn't holding on to him anymore. So Tracy would punch him in the face and knock Jeffrey off his balance, and he ran towards the front door. So around 11:30 on the night of July 22nd, Tracy Edwards would flag down 2 police officers. It's on the corner of North 25th Street. These officers noted that Edwards had a handcuff attached to his wrist, and he explained to the officers that there was a freak that had placed handcuffs upon him and asked if the police could remove them. When the officers' handcuff keys failed to fit the brand of handcuffs, Tracy agreed to accompany the police officers to the apartment, where Tracy stated that he had spent the past 5 hours trying to escape. The police sort of at this stage didn't really want to engage in this because they thought it was a homosexual fight, was the sort of way that they put it. But the police thought they at least ought to check out this situation because they just didn't sort of, they did get a gut feel that it wasn't completely right. The door to apartment 213 was opened by a nice-looking 31-year-old by the name of Jeffrey Dahmer. He was very calm. He's very rational. He even offers to go and get the key to the handcuffs in his bedroom. Tracy remembered that that's where the knife was, and he also knew that there was the possibility that he wasn't getting out of this. Now, one of the officers decided to go into the bedroom himself and actually take a look. He noticed photographs lying around that kind of shocked him. Dismembered human bodies, skulls in the refrigerator, dismembered human bodies. It just, a lot of shock for him. It's when he finally collects himself that he yells at his partner to cuff Jeffrey Dahmer straight away and place him under arrest. They find more photos of dismembered victims and body parts in the refrigerator and freezer. And shortly afterwards, the site of crews in biohazard protection suits taking evidence out of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment was televised for all over the world. The suits were necessary because of the smell of decay in the apartment and because of the acid in the barrel. So he is caught red-handed. There's an amazing amount of physical evidence against him, it's really not that surprising that Jeffrey Dahmer would immediately confess. You have no way, shape, or form to get yourself out of this situation. Like, sorry, there is no way to explain why you, Jeffrey Dahmer, have body parts and photos, and there would be an overwhelming evidence of your previous arrests. It was more his dry and unemotional descriptions of the murdering of the 12.5 men that the police were just like, there was so much of the reality of his brutality and his sadism. He also claimed, and Jeffrey claimed, that he needed to drink heavily to be able to face killing people. But we know already that he was a pretty hardcore alcoholic for much of his life. So for me, it feels like he is making excuses in order to start a defense. So on July 25th, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22nd, he'd been charged with a further 11 murders committed in Wisconsin. And on September 14th, investigators in Ohio would uncover hundreds of bone fragments in woodland behind the address in which Jeffrey Dahmer had confessed to killing his first victim. And they would end up being identified with 2 molars and vertebrae that the victim was actually Stephen Hicks. 3 days later, Jeffrey Dahmer was charged by authorities in Ohio for Stephen Hicks's murder. He was not charged with the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards and nor the murder of Stephen Toomey. He was not charged with Stephen Toomey's murder because the district attorney only brought charges where murder could be proven within a reasonable doubt. And Jeffrey Dahmer had no actual recollection of this murder, and there's no physical evidence that the crime ever existed. So at a scheduled preliminary hearing on January 13th in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer pled guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. His trial would begin on January 30th, 1992. He was tried in Milwaukee for 15 counts of first-degree murder before a Judge Lawrence Graham. By pleading guilty to the charges, he waived his rights to a trial to establish guilt. During the trial, though, attorneys debated whether Dahmer had a mental or personality disorder. So the prosecution argued that any disorders did not prevent Dahmer from understanding his criminality of his actions or resisting his impulses. The defense would argue that Dahmer had a mental disease and was driven by uncontrollable obsessions and impulses. There was a lot of back and forth, guys, in regards to whether Jeffrey Dahmer was mentally insane, was insane or suffered from a mental disorder. But after the trial occurred, so the jury would only deliberate for 5 hours and decided that Jeff Dahmer did not deserve to spend the rest of his life in a hospital, but in a prison cell. So on all 15 counts, he was found guilty and sane. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentence terms, and at the sentencing, he actually read a prepared statement in which he expressed sorrow for the pain he had caused. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends. I now know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a holocaust. Thank God there will be no more harm that I can do. I believe that only the Lord Jesus Christ can save me from my sins. He later would plead guilty to aggravated murder in Ohio in the death of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole for that one. Jeffrey Dahmer was actually murdered by 2 inmates on the 28th of November in 1994. I'm not going to get into that. There's a lot of speculation that it was a setup. I think it was the best possible outcome for the victims' families that he died, because they, I think, in some way, shape, or form, are the ones that deserved the justice of him perhaps having the death penalty rather than life sentences. But that's not for me to judge. But it's definitely for the victims' families. I think that they got a sense of justice for themselves. But thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode. If you like this podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Go back and listen to all of those amazing episodes beforehand. I've got 2 bonus episodes on the Menendez brothers. I've also got a bonus episode on Martha Moxley. There's quite a different array of serial killers, so please feel free to go back and watch them. If you do like this episode though as well, hit that like button. If you have any comments, feel free to do them, guys. See you later. Bye.